Since it's highly likely we're going to be in a La Nina pattern this hurricane season, that means that we're more likely to see hurricane landfalls right up along the United States coast, and certain areas could get a little bit more exposed than others during a La Nina hurricane season. And the reason why is because we see that the easterly flow along the upper levels of the westerly flow along the upper levels of the atmosphere is a lot weaker. We see much weaker upper level winds over the Atlantic, and what that means is that we're going to see less of those strong westerly upper level winds push storms out to sea, and rather we're more likely to see storm systems move closer to the coast. Unfortunately, up along the Caribbean could get involved, and of course the United States, since we're going to see less of a westerly flow that would push the storm systems to the east away from the coast. And of course, it's not just the weak westerly winds that will allow more storm systems to make landfall in the United States, but generally speaking, during La Nina, more storm systems form. So there's of course a higher probability when we see more hurricanes, tropical storms develop in the Atlantic when it comes to landfalls in the United States. Here's how the tracks of La Nina hurricanes during the past 30 years. We see plenty more compared to El Nino hurricanes the past 30 years. And not only that, we see the storm tracks a lot further eastward thanks to the weaker westerly flow that's associated with La Nina patterns. So this is definitely going to raise the possibility of landfalls pretty much all throughout the United States coast, even extending as far north as the Northeast, the Southeast, especially the Southeast. I'll pay very close attention to. That's definitely where La Nina hurricanes like to track towards, right up along the southeast coast of the Atlantic, as well as the Gulf of Mexico. So you definitely need to be prepared for this. And of course, in the areas further westward, like Texas, easily gets more hurricane landfalls during La Nina seasons compared to El Nino hurricane seasons. Combining that with the fact that sea surface temperatures all throughout the Atlantic are going to be much warmer than average, and not only warmer than average, but possibly record-breaking when it comes to how far the deficit is between average when it comes to the water temperature, which means that we're more likely to see much more hurricanes, even though during a La Nina, generally speaking, we see an above average amount of hurricanes. I think this hurricane season is expected to be hyperactive and potentially historic, as it seems like the perfect storm of patterns when it comes to historical sea surface temperature anomalies we're seeing, as well as a strong La Nina pattern that's expected to build. That's just a perfect storm of just a recipe for hyperactive hurricane season. So that will certainly raise the probability of storm systems moving to making landfall in the United States. But that's not the only reason why I want to show you guys a sea surface temperatures anomaly, because like I showed you guys in one of my previous videos regarding where exactly that Bermuda Azores high will develop, I want to bring this up again because the sea surface temperatures could indicate whether or not the Bermuda Azores high will be stronger or weaker than usual, and it could also give us indication of where exactly it'll position itself. Typically speaking, when we see the sea surface temperatures a little bit too much more warmer than average, where the Bermuda Azores high would typically be located, then that would weaken the Bermuda Azores high, and that'll allow more storm systems to be able to move out to sea thanks to a weaker Bermuda Azores high that isn't as powerful to steer those storms further westward. However, unfortunately, where the Bermuda Azores high is located, we see that there is at least a good amount of small pockets where the sea surface temperatures are either close to the average or slightly below average, and I think that will certainly promote more of a sinking motion right over this area, and it's a little bit further westward into the United States as well. And of course, when it comes to the atmosphere, there needs to be an equal amount of sinking air as there is rising air, and when we're seeing sea surface temperatures this warm over the Atlantic, as well as the fact that we're going to be in a La Nina and right over the main development region as well, all that air that rises associated with tropical cyclones in the main development region needs to sink somewhere, and that typically happens where the sea surface temperatures are cooler than normal, where the the air is a bit more dense because of the colder air mass that's simply above cooler than average sea surface temperature. So it would sink right over this area, and that's exactly the area where the Bermuda Azores High will be located, which is the reason why I expect the Bermuda Azores High to be stronger this season if this trend continues, where the sea surface temperatures will be hovering closer to average, and that will mean that storm systems would move further westward, which will also enhance the possibility of U.S. landfalls when it comes to hurricanes and even tropical storms as well. Now, I think another thing that's very important to look at as well is analog years. And analog years are pretty much years that have conditions that are very similar to what we're experiencing right now. And that could give us a good indication of how this hurricane season will turn out based on the conditions we're experiencing right now by taking a look at years that are very similar to this one. So the years that really stand out to me are the hurricane seasons of 1995, 1998, as well as 2010, 2011, going into the hurricane season of 2016 as well as the more recent hurricane seasons of 2021 and 2022. And the reasons why those years stand out to me as being very similar to this season is because during those hurricane seasons, we were going from an El Nino, or I shouldn't say an El Nino pattern, but we were certainly going from a neutral pattern transitioning into a La Nina pattern by the time we approach a hurricane season, which is very reminiscent of what we're seeing right now. We're currently in the neutral pattern, quickly expected to enter a La Nina pattern by the time we approach a hurricane season. And taking a quick look at all those hurricane seasons, it's definitely not a good sign, and it definitely points towards more landfalls in the United States, like I'm going to show you right now. So this is a hurricane season of 1995. Not only was it a very active hurricane season, but we saw plenty of storm systems move well further westward into the Gulf of Mexico. We did see a pretty powerful hurricane make landfall right around southern Florida, extending into the southern, right around the right in between Mississippi and Louisiana. And we saw other tropical cyclones move a lot further westward than we'd see during an average hurricane season, which gives a good indication that we're likely going to see storm systems move a little bit further westward this hurricane season, and that puts the Gulf Coast as well as the Caribbean at risk for more tropical cyclone landfalls. And even shifting our focus a little bit further eastward, we see a decent amount of tropical cyclones moving up the east coast as well, where we saw two tropical cyclones come uncomfortably close to the mid-Atlantic. In fact, we did see a hurricane landfall during the 1995 hurricane season right over Long Island, extending into New England as well. So that certainly puts the Northeast more at risk based on what the 1995 hurricane season looked like. Here's a quick look at the 1998 hurricane season, another year that's very similar to the type of conditions we're experiencing right now. And we do see plenty of storms did develop this hurricane season, and we saw quite a few of them move further westward as well, and one hurricane landfall right over the Gulf Coast. And same goes for the North Carolina coast during the hurricane season of 1998. Here's the 2011 hurricane season, and of course, very similar. We saw many more storms, hurricanes form than usual, tropical cyclones form, and the big tropical cyclone during the 2011 hurricane season was Hurricane Irene, made landfall in North Carolina and moved up the East Coast, bringing billions of dollars in damages. So it's certainly based on the 2011 hurricane season being a similar. Having similar conditions as what we're experiencing right now, it gives a better indication that we're certainly bound to see more landfalls even as far north as the Northeast for the 2024 hurricane season. Because it's not every day that a hurricane moves up the East Coast in this specific direction, where we saw a landfall right over New York City. So the chance of tropical cyclone making landfall in the Northeast is certainly a lot higher. Here's the 2016 hurricane season. We did see more tropical cyclones develop than usual, and we saw there were primarily two major threats to the United States this hurricane season. We, of course, had Hurricane Hermine, I'm pretty sure its name was. I could be wrong about that. Feel free to correct me in the comment section. But it did, this hurricane, if it's called Hermine, did make landfall along the Big Bend area of Florida as a Category 1 hurricane. And then, of course, the big one was Hurricane Matthew, which just brought plenty of devastation right over Haiti, Cuba, extending into the Bahamas, and then just brushed pretty much the entire southeast coast, bringing plenty of damage with it. So this also could give a good indication that we could be in for more impactful storm systems making landfall as well. Here's the 2021 hurricane season, and we saw plenty of tropical cyclones develop, and we saw many of them develop a lot further westward and move a lot further westward, as I do remember this hurricane season for me personally here in New Jersey, as we didn't necessarily see any landfalling tropical cyclones here in New Jersey, but we saw plenty of tropical cyclones just brush the area with very heavy rain. The big one, of course, being Hurricane Ida, making landfall along the Louisiana coast at nearly Category 5 strength, and then it just moved up the coast, brought plenty of flooding over the northeast, especially since the ground was already pretty saturated thanks to Tropical Storm Henri making landfall just a week prior over New England. So this also gives a good indication that storm systems will head a little bit further westward this hurricane season. And last but not least, here's a 2022 hurricane season, as it was a little bit more tame, but of course a big tropical cyclone was Ian. For some reason I couldn't think of it at the top of my head, but Hurricane Ian, of course, made landfall right over the Fort Myers area as a Category 4 hurricane, and thankfully most tropical cyclones were moved out to sea, but we did see 2 hurricane landfalls at hurricane season right over Florida. Another thing that's pointing towards more landfalls happening this hurricane season over the United States is taking a look at the climatology models. And as you can clearly see, we're going to see a strong amount of ridging right over the main development region, as I believe this will be strong enough to be able to steer storms right towards the east coast of the United States, as well as the Gulf of Mexico, where we don't really see an area where there's going to be just enough troughing in over the main development region to steer these storms out to sea. Unfortunately, it seems like the average forecast is that we're going to see a bit more ridging over the main development region than usual. That will certainly enhance the possibility of landfalls this hurricane season over the east coast, as well as the Gulf of Mexico. We're going to need to see if this keeps up. Of course, climatology models aren't always accurate, but I would believe this idea as being more likely to happen than not to happen at this point, since these computer models at least have some sort of data. In fact, this specific computer model combines a lot of the most reliable computer models, so they at least have some knowledge regarding of what's going to happen in the future. So I'd expect this scenario to occur as being more likely than it not happening at all. So that's certainly unfortunate, and I think that will lead to many more tropical cyclones making landfall over the southeast. So this was the forecast I made regarding where exactly the Bermuda Azores High will be located in one of my previous videos I did recently. And I'm expecting the most landfalls to happen right up along the southeast coast and the Gulf of Mexico, because all the analog years, all the years very similar to the years resemble the conditions that we're seeing right now, point towards tropical cyclones moving towards this sort of direction into the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the southeast Atlantic coast, with the occasional ones moving up the northeast coast. So in general, throughout the entire United States coast, you should expect a higher probability of landfalls. And like I said, where the Bermuda Azores High is typically located, the sea surf temperatures are, compared to at least the rest of the Atlantic, are a bit cooler and closer to average, which means that I think that the Bermuda Azores High will be stronger than usual to steer storms further westward. And the climatology models also are pointing towards this idea. So I use this map to make my probability forecast regarding the frequency of when each area within a 50-mile radius gets impacted by a landfalling hurricane. And as you can see, the most common areas where you do receive the most landfalls most frequently include the southern coast of Louisiana, extending into the southeast coast of Florida, right around the Miami area, where you typically see one hurricane landfall every 6 years on average. And for southern Louisiana, it's around one hurricane landfall every 7 years. And then for the coast of North Carolina, of course, since the Outer Banks pops out so much over the Atlantic, right before the strong westerly winds take hold and steer storms out to sea, you see typically one hurricane landfall every 5 years over the Outer Banks of North Carolina, at least within a 50-mile radius. And then for the areas for the northward and northeast, of course, the chance is lower. Right around the New York City metropolitan area, you typically see only one hurricane at landfall, at least within a 50-mile radius, every 19 years. As in the northeast, it does get pretty tough because the westerly winds do become quite strong, and they naturally just want to steer storms well out to sea before they come close to New York City. And the chance is even lower right around the Maine area, where it's pretty much a once-in-a-lifetime chance you receive a landfalling hurricane right up along the coast of Maine. It is the chance is a bit higher right around the Cape Cod area, but then other areas like the southeast coast, like South Carolina, Georgia, you typically see one hurricane landfall every decade or so. And same goes for the Houston metropolitan area and extending into the west coast of Florida. So but of course, with this hurricane season, with all the indications, the chance will be higher than what you see right here. Like I'm gonna show you guys in my forecast map. So here's my probability forecast regarding the possibility of a hurricane making landfall within 50-mile radius along each area. So starting with the coast of Maine, extending into the Boston area, it's only a 5% chance because, like I said, the wind shear is just very strong, from way too strong most years to allow storm systems to take a track that takes a landfall right over Maine and Massachusetts. And it's very difficult for a ridge to be at a position that far up north for tropical cyclones to take a track like that. It has happened, but it's extremely rare, so I'm expecting a low 5% chance of a hurricane making landfall. However, for much of the mid-Atlantic northeast coast, for places like the New York City metro area, extending along the Jersey Shore and down the Maryland coastline, I'm expecting a higher 15% chance of a hurricane making landfall, which is definitely higher than, let's say, around a 7% chance you see a hurricane making landfall. So around the chances twice as high this hurricane season with a hurricane making landfall, at least based on my prediction, based on several factors like a La Nina pattern, the fact that we're going to see a stronger amount of ridging based on what the climatology models are stating. So I do believe there's a higher probability of storm systems tracking a little bit further westward. Still a relatively low chance, relatively speaking, but it's certainly higher than what you've seen in other hurricane seasons. And then for the coast of North Carolina, of course, it's a much higher 25% chance. So I'm giving around a 1/4 probability of a hurricane making landfall, around 20% chance right up along the coast of South Carolina, extending into Georgia, 15% chance for the northern coast of Florida, as it's very difficult for tropical cyclone to move in a position where it makes landfall along the northern coast of Florida, but it's definitely not as difficult along the southeast coast of Florida, where I'm expecting a very relatively high 30% chance. In fact, the highest out of any region in the United States, mainly due to the fact that we see quite a bit of tropical cyclone landfalls during La Nina hurricane seasons right over Florida. So I'm expecting a higher 30% chance of a hurricane making landfall right over this area. And then mostly a 15 to 20% chance for the Gulf Coast, more specifically a 20% chance right around New York, the New Orleans metropolitan area, which is certainly higher than what a higher chance than what you typically see. So throughout the entirety of the United States coast, make sure to prepare for a higher probability of a hurricane making landfall. But whether this hurricane season exceeds our expectations or falls below it, just remember all it takes is one storm to completely change your life and the lives of millions of people. So you don't want to underestimate the hurricane season. Let's say if it does fall below your expectations when it comes to the amount of storms or landfalls we see. So make sure to prepare for every storm system that moves through with the same amount of urgency. But yeah, guys, that's it for now, and I thank you guys for watching.